You probably know her as Queen Elizabeth I, aka the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor monarch, the monarch with the weird half-sister, Mary, Queen of Scots, the woman who famously outsmarted the Spanish Armada, the one who had an awkward friendship with Sir Walter Raleigh. The Earl was rumored to have fallen in love with his student, and some say that Elizabeth returned these affections. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth was called back to England to take her place on the throne. But here's the kicker. According to the conspiracy theorists, she never did. Elizabeth could have been a secret dude, a master of disguise. Please like and subscribe so you never miss an exciting installment of Boring History for Sleep. Until next time, remember, stay curious, stay kind, and stay sleepy. A pawn in a political game or any combination of the above. There's even a popular theory that she was intersex. But you don't need to worry, sleepyheads. Either way, she ruled like a boss, and that's all that really matters. She remained the Earl of Oxford. They say she was crowned in a secret ceremony and then took on her sister's title to protect her identity. Why, you ask? Well, back in the 1500s, you couldn't be both the monarch and a dude. Things were a bit more complicated than that. Long story short, you couldn't pass down the throne to a male heir if you were a man. So, to ensure her bloodline's continuation, Elizabeth, or should I say Richard, needed to keep his royal penis under wraps. And the ruler who reigned for an impressive 45 years. But what if everything you know about good old Beth is a big fat lie? Well, apparently he had good reason. You see, Elizabeth's cousin, the aforementioned Mary, Queen of Scots, had a son named James, and if Mary hadn't been whacked, she would have been first in line after their father, Henry VIII. This little tyke was considered the rightful heir by many, including Mary, who believed that Henry's will had been forged so that she wouldn't inherit the throne. As a result, Mary tried everything to secure the crown for her son, even plotting with various nobles to depose her sister Elizabeth. If James had become king, England could have gone the way of Scotland, becoming a Catholic monarchy ruled by a Stuart dynasty. Yikes. Not exactly what Elizabeth had in mind. What if she never actually was Queen Elizabeth at all? A closeted queen? Or just an elaborate myth? Historians are divided, but the truth may never be known. Elizabeth's gender has been questioned for centuries. In 1936, a doctor examined a portrait and argued that Elizabeth had male features. He pointed to her hands, which appear more masculine than feminine, and argued that her fingers overlap in a way that women of the time period did untypically do. Then in 2001, a Canadian author published a book arguing that Elizabeth was bisexual, not necessarily transgender. Buckle up, sleepyheads. We're about to blow your mind. Okay, so this is pretty unhinged. The core of the theory is that Elizabeth I was actually Elizabeth, Earl of Oxford, and she faked being a woman to keep her bloodline safe. Now, before you call me crazy, hear me out. When Elizabeth was born, she was next in line after her older sister, Mary, Queen of Scots. You see, their dad, Henry VIII, had married 2 women before he settled on good old Mary. He wed Catherine of Aragon, then Anne Boleyn, and then Jane Seymour. 2 of those marriages produced legitimate children, Mary, Henry's daughter with Catherine, and Elizabeth, his daughter with Anne. Fun fact. Henry also had 2 illegitimate children during his marriage to Anne. And if you're wondering how we know they were his, it's because he wrote love letters to them, which is vile, but also sweet, I guess. Anyway, back to our would-be queen. Because Elizabeth was born out of wedlock to the infamous Anne Boleyn, she was declared illegitimate. After Anne lost her head in 1536, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and stripped of her title, the Lady Margaret. She was only given the style of the most excellent princess of England while living in her father's court. Not exactly what you'd call a royal upbringing. I mean, she wasn't allowed to call herself a princess. So, when Mary ascended to the throne in 1553, Elizabeth found herself in a precarious position. Mary hated her sister's guts and almost immediately began proceedings to have her executed for treason. That's right. This royal rumble was so bad it nearly ended in bloodshed before it even began. Talk about sibling rivalry. So, naturally, Elizabeth fled to safety in the court of her former tutor, the Earl of Oxford. And here's where things get really interesting. But why would he choose such a ridiculous disguise? So was she a master of disguise? The truth is, thanks to the lack of solid evidence, anything is possible. Thanks for joining me on this Royal Rumble, Sleepyheads. I'm your host. If you enjoyed this episode, alright, you win. That is terrifying. But we have to keep going. We've got a legend to investigate. So our strange tale begins in a quiet village called Bisley. Historian Tracy Borman believes that Leck likely made the whole thing up. In the letter, Weaver writes of an old woman who lived in Bisley and recalled seeing the Lady Elizabeth. Well, the first thing you should know is that Elizabeth did, in fact, stay at Bisley for a time. In October of 1536, she accompanied her mother, Anne Boleyn, to visit her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, who lived nearby. But there's no evidence that she ever got sick or that she died there. Now, if you're doing the math at home, you'll note that this would have put Elizabeth at around 10 years old. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more historical parenting pitfalls, including our series on the childhoods of famous historical people. Well, that seems highly unlikely for a number of reasons. For one thing, Henry VIII was known for having his enemies executed, but he doted on his children, especially his daughter Elizabeth. He would never have allowed anything to happen to her. Not to mention, if the Queen gave birth to a stillborn son, I'm sure the entire kingdom would have been pretty thrilled. They were desperate for an heir. Also, given that Elizabeth's mother, Anne, was executed less than 2 years later, it seems unlikely that Henry would have been tricked so easily. Which doesn't really make any sense considering the story claims that she died as a toddler. I mean, think of all the people who would have been involved in such a plot. It would have taken a lot of people to pull off, and even then, it only would have worked for so long. Eventually, somebody would have spilled the beans. But Weaver goes on to write that the villagers believe she died there and was buried in the chancel of the church, drawing from similar stories about other royal children. As for Ross's story, well, he might have gotten that one from an oral tradition, meaning it could have been told and retold so many times over the years that no one was sure if it were true anymore. You might remember that Weaver wrote of an old woman who lived in Bisley and recalled seeing the Lady Elizabeth. Well, in 1998, local historian Mary Pryor located the grave of that woman, whose name, according to the headstone, was Elizabeth. Could this be the very Elizabeth who lived out her days in Bisley and who inspired these legends hundreds of years later? Maybe, the year before 1536, there had been an outbreak of plague who published it in 1845. More than 300 years after the fact. There's another one from 1790, written by one Charles Lick. Lick tells the tale of how Elizabeth was sent to live with her grandmother, the Duchess of York, where she was cared for by a wet nurse named Margaret Blogg. Seemed like a good, wholesome story until you realize that none of it actually happened because the Duchess of York died in 1503, 30 years before Elizabeth was even born. How could Elizabeth have possibly stayed with her? And being that he was writing it so long after the fact, he likely didn't even know if it were true. He just thought it was a fun story to tell, and honestly, a pretty plausible one too. I mean, can you imagine telling Henry VIII that you lost his daughter? You'd probably get executed for that. So it makes sense why someone would try to cover it up. And young Elizabeth, the future Queen of England, was sent there in an attempt to escape it. She was only 2 years old at the time. Now, legend has it that when she arrived, she immediately fell ill and died. Her caretakers, terrified of the wrath of King Henry VIII, panicked and replaced her with a look-alike, a red-haired boy from the village who they dressed up as Elizabeth and sent back to the king. Now, this story comes to us courtesy of one John Rouse, but sadly, this isn't the only story about Elizabeth's childhood that was written down centuries after the fact. And as for Margaret Blogg, well, historians have found no record of her either. In fact, the earliest written account we have of this particular story comes from a letter written in 1675 by one John Weaver to the English antiquarian Sir Robert Cotton. So what's the real story? As for the possibility of her being switched with a village boy, not to mention if there had been some sort of switch at a birthplace, wouldn't somebody have noticed at some point? Finally, if we go back to that letter from 1675, hi everyone. Elizabeth I of England, also known as the Virgin Queen, never married. She never had children. And throughout her 44-year reign, she made no secret of the fact that she considered herself to be married to England. There were a few attempts at the beginning of her reign. People always talk. And there was something else about Elizabeth that fueled their gossiping tongues. One day, 2 foreign ambassadors were visiting Elizabeth in her court. The 2 men were staying in the royal palace and were sharing a room. In the middle of the night, they heard a strange noise and woke up to see Elizabeth standing in the doorway. She was completely naked except for a small towel that covered her private parts. The ambassadors were shocked, but Elizabeth just smiled and invited them to join her. Then she disappeared as quickly as she had come. Elizabeth I never had children, but people have questioned whether that was because she didn't want children or if she simply couldn't have them. They described how Elizabeth had beckoned to them with a finger and then vanished into thin air. When the king received the letter, he was furious and immediately dispatched 2 of his guards to find Elizabeth and bring her to him. The guards searched everywhere, but she was nowhere to be found. Eventually, they gave up and returned home empty-handed. Part of the reason people talked about this is because Elizabeth made no secret of the fact that she considered herself married to England. However, there is no evidence that it ever happened. Most historians agree that it was made up by the ambassadors in order to make Elizabeth look bad. Why? Who knows? Maybe they were jealous that she was the most powerful woman in England and they wanted to bring her down a peg. Or maybe they really did see something that they weren't supposed to and panicked. Whatever the reason, there is no evidence to support their claim. And it should be noted that Elizabeth was known for her sense of humor. It's entirely possible that she was just playing around and that she did go to the ambassador's room that night, but not in the way that they expected. In fact, she delighted in throwing herself into the role. She wore a crown designed to look like a wedding ring and referred to banquets in her honor as wedding feasts. She even went so far as to declare that any threat to her was a threat to England itself. But after the death of her cousin, the future Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth grew closer to her, while others say that she was in love with a member of her own court. Either way, the lack of children was conspicuous. There were plenty of opportunities for Elizabeth to conceive, but none resulted in a pregnancy. Some believe that she may have been intersex or transgender, which could explain why she was so adamant about never marrying. Of course, these claims are based entirely on speculation. There is no evidence that she was anything other than a woman, and eventually decided that she would rather be alone than have someone by her side who was untruly worthy. It was likely a good decision from a political standpoint. As an unmarried woman, she could travel throughout her kingdom freely, meeting with her people and seeing things for herself without having to worry about where her husband might be or what he might be doing. Now, that might sound sweet and poetic, but people talked. They talked about how Elizabeth never seemed to undress in front of anyone, and they talked about how her skin was strangely rough and her voice much deeper than expected. Was she hiding a deformity? Was she covering up for being biologically male? Let's get into it. It is well known that Elizabeth I never married, but people talked. Now, some historians say that she was just deeply devoted to her country. However, there is one story that has been passed down through history that might make you question what you think you know about Elizabeth I. The next day, the ambassadors wrote a letter to their king telling him everything that had happened the night before. This story has been passed down through the ages and is often used as proof that Elizabeth was intersex or transgender. Thanks for watching. Did you know that Elizabeth I's clothes were legendary? They were lush, elaborate, carefully designed. But they were also, depending on the source, a little bit ridiculous. I mean, can you imagine wearing 40 layers of clothing? Well, apparently Elizabeth I did just that. She wore up to 40 layers, including thick ruffs and high collars that hid her neck and shoulders. Some say it was fashion. Others say it was a way to conceal an Adam's apple. Welcome back to the channel. One theory is that Elizabeth was self-conscious about her figure. This would have been scandalous because it would have meant that she wasn't a virgin. There are 2 possible explanations for this. The first is that she was born with a large Adam's apple. The second is that she developed a large Adam's apple after giving birth to a child or children. This is where things get a little bit crazy. An Adam's apple or something else? Be sure to subscribe for more videos on all aspects of history. Maybe she was just vain, or maybe she had a really good reason. We may never know for sure. But one thing is certain, Elizabeth I's clothes were legendary. After all, she was known for being rather plump. By wearing these clothes, she could have been trying to hide her weight. Another theory is that Elizabeth was trying to hide her age. By wearing these clothes, she could have been trying to hide the fact that she was in her 60s. Finally, there is the theory that Elizabeth was trying to hide something else, something that would cause a scandal if it were revealed. This is where things get interesting. Today we are discussing all of the secrets hidden under Elizabeth I's clothing. The first layer was a linen underdress. She may have also given birth to a daughter who died in infancy. She would not have been the first queen to keep her rooms locked when she was getting dressed. It was not uncommon for women of the time period to wear clothing that concealed their bodies. In fact, it was considered fashionable to do so. However, Elizabeth was different. She was the Queen of England. What she did was watched and talked about throughout the land. If she was hiding something, everyone wanted to know what it was. These rumors are based on historical records that show that Elizabeth was pregnant at least twice during her marriage, but both pregnancies ended in tragedy. There is no hard evidence to support these claims, but they have been fueled by the fact that Elizabeth never married again, and she kept her rooms locked when she was getting dressed. Then a French hood, then a pair of very tight-fitting sleeves that were designed to make her shoulders look really narrow. Then came the gown itself, which was usually made of silk or velvet and was, of course, very, very full. Then there was a farthingale, which was a cage-like structure that helped the wearer, in this case Elizabeth, stand out. There were also 2 underskirts to hold out the full skirts of the dresses. Her clothes were more than just beautiful, they were a carefully constructed image. And if you were Elizabeth, you would want to do the same. Over all of this, she would put on a ruff, and not just any ruff, mind you, but one that was stiff and starched. No one was allowed to be in the room when she was getting dressed, not even her ladies-in-waiting. Servants had to knock on the door and wait until they heard, "You may enter." Before they were allowed to come in, Elizabeth had a very specific way of doing things, and she liked to keep her routine to herself. This ruff could be up to 40 inches wide. Then came the necklace, the veil, the overskirt, and finally the Spanish farthingale, which was used to keep the wind from blowing up her skirt. And yes, with all of these layers, it is no wonder that Elizabeth needed help getting dressed. Elizabeth's clothing had several undergarments, some for warmth, some for support, and some were just plain weird. But wait, there's more. However, she wasn't the only one who had to be careful of what people saw. Now, why would she have done this? Why would she have hidden her body under all of those layers? There is a story that Elizabeth had an Adam's apple the size of a walnut. It is rumored that Elizabeth gave birth to a stillborn son a few months after her marriage to Philip II of Spain. If Elizabeth did have children, so what was Elizabeth hiding? Thank you for watching. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, she was an unrepentant virgin. But she wasn't alone. Turns out her coffin was, too. Yeah, that's right. For 4 centuries, historians assumed she'd been buried in a coffin with a secret second compartment, where her heart could rest separately from her other remains. The night before her scheduled burial, an open casket with her body lay in state in Westminster Hall. Historians describe her as short, though they also say that she wore exceptionally high heels, so much so that she sometimes tripped while walking. Her shoes were likely a 9 or a 9.5 in modern measurements. But despite her somewhat dainty stature, the coffin used for her burial was nearly 7 feet long, which made absolutely no sense to those around her at the time. One of them even wrote that it seemed inconveniently big. Plus, Elizabeth's body was never thoroughly autopsied, no mention of embalming. And according to an account from 1829, her coffin didn't smell like a dead person's coffin should, which gave rise to the rumor that her body had been stuffed with something else to take up space. According to those who saw her, her body looked lifelike, even though it had already started to bloat and sag. In 1829, workers renovated the abbey and discovered Elizabeth's coffin. And if it didn't contain anything besides her remains? And if it didn't smell like a dead person because she was already dead, well, then what gives? Nobody knows for sure. But one researcher speculated that Elizabeth might have been laid to rest in a much bigger coffin than anyone thought she needed because she liked to be surrounded by luxury. So maybe instead of resting in peace, she rested in a cavernous, luxurious coffin. It was then disinterred once again in 1860, leading to the second-hand account written by one Mr. J.R. Greenall. He reported that the coffin was unusually large and seemed to contain something else besides the Queen's remains. That something else was chalk, which had been used to keep the body from decomposing until it could be buried. But Mr. Greenall didn't realize that because back then embalming fluid and sawdust were often mixed with chalk. And because Elizabeth's body had already started to decompose when she was buried, there would have been little need to embalm her in the first place. The next day, people lined up for hours to walk past the coffin while it was moved to Westminster Abbey. There, 15 pallbearers carried the coffin into the church. It was placed on a catafalque or raised platform near the high altar, and then 6 of the pallbearers left, presumably to go have a nice meal after their hard work. Then 2 monks sang a psalm as 2 more pallbearers left. 2 more monks sang another psalm as 2 more pallbearers left. And finally, the last 2 pallbearers left and the coffin was lowered into the tomb. Everyone seemed pretty satisfied that the Queen was dead, except for one guy who tried to convince everyone that she was actually dead by throwing a ring into the open grave. But mostly everyone just thought he was an idiot. The whole affair was exhausting. So maybe that's why nobody noticed anything odd about the size of the coffin. But now some are saying there never was a second compartment at all. Instead, Elizabeth might have been laid to rest in a much bigger coffin than anyone thought she needed. Hi, I'm your host and this is my channel. When Queen Elizabeth I kicked the bucket back in 1603, she left no clear heir. That meant that when she died, her closest living relative, her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, took the throne. He became James I of England too, and he ruled over both Scotland and England simultaneously. But that meant that his mother, who had been the Queen of Scots before him, was now the late Queen of England. So naturally she deserved a really nice funeral, and boy did she get one. Elizabeth wasn't exactly tiny, but she wasn't exactly tall or muscular either. But a 2018 study finally put these rumors to rest by looking into the very source that inspired them. So if the coffin didn't seem too big for Elizabeth's petite frame, I'm not sure why we thought this was a good idea. Our entire plan hinged on this one event: the delivery of a small wooden box to a specific location in the middle of London at precisely 2 p.m. That's when she stopped them, telling them it would be better if she just died. Maybe something scandalous? Well, here's the thing. Whatever was in that box doesn't matter because we don't actually know what happened to it. The point of this story isn't to talk about the Queen Mother's private parts or her illnesses. I've been impulsive, irresponsible, sloppy, lazy. So naturally I've amassed a fair number of enemies who probably know some pretty embarrassing things about me. According to the FBI, an estimated 26 million Americans have been affected by it, which means chances are you know someone who's been blackmailed, or worse, you might be the one who's been targeted. This is the kind of blackmail that keeps you up at night, but you can protect yourself. You can take control by knowing everything about everyone. Well, the answer is complicated, but it starts with knowing your own risk factors. I mean, yeah, sure, that's the juicy gossip. But the point of this story is to talk about power because Elizabeth managed to keep secrets that would have been considered extremely inconvenient if they got out. And that is how monarchs keep secrets. But then she did something very unmonarchical. The Queen Mother, in fact, was an expert at keeping secrets, which is why she became the Queen's personal choice for running the country's intelligence services. Not MI6, CIS MI5, GCHQ, MI6 and CIS are separate. For all her quirks, Elizabeth had impeccable judgment when it came to national security. She kept secrets so well that some people believe she was involved in the country's most heinous activities, including torture. She soiled herself. Why do you think she wanted everyone else's medical records? I'm not saying she was a tyrannical busybody who wanted to peer into every citizen's bedroom. That's not it at all. What I'm saying is, she believed that if she knew everything about everyone, they couldn't blackmail her. And frankly, it worked. Her doctors were horrified, and yet somehow also unsurprised. They had known this might happen. People tried to blackmail kings and queens long before the modern era. If a monarch is in a compromising position, their enemies can threaten to expose them unless the monarch does what they want. And those enemies won't be satisfied with just a formal investigation. They'll dig up dirt. They'll pay informants. They'll hack computers. They'll read emails. They'll use every dirty trick in the book to get what they want because blackmail is an art form. See, the thing was Elizabeth had never allowed anyone to examine her from head to toe while she was awake. And they suspected there was a reason for that. She had two rare conditions that made her extremely self-conscious. First, she had a curvature of the spine, which gave her a chronic back problem. Second, she had a rare genetic disorder called progeria, which caused her skin to age much faster than it should have. As a result, she was extremely private about her body. And her doctors, while concerned, knew better than to push. The Queen Mother didn't want to die, but she also didn't want to live like a lab rat, so she accepted her fate. She died at home without a doctor ever seeing her fully. No autopsies, no invasive post-mortem exams. In fact, no doctor ever officially declared her dead. Instead, her physician stood at the foot of her bed and announced, "I'm afraid the Queen Mother has died," which may sound dramatic. But really, that's just how it's done for senior members of the British monarchy. It's their right. Now, I'm sitting here waiting for it to happen. Waiting is always the worst part. So let me back up a bit. Let's start at the beginning. Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was notoriously private about her health. She avoided physicians whenever she could. And even when she was sick, she resisted full medical exams. So when she came down with a bad case of the flu in 1983, she told her doctors, "I'll get over it by Easter," which meant she wasn't going to see a doctor. When they insisted, she eventually agreed to let them take her temperature, but only after warning them, "I'm rather scared of doctors." Of course, they found out why. Her temperature was 102.4. She still refused a full examination, though. A few days later, she developed breathing difficulties and her doctors prepared to intubate her. But now, decades later, someone wants to find out exactly what was in that wooden box. Was it a secret love letter? A hidden diary? This isn't the first time I've talked about Elizabeth. But if she was so private about her own health, now I've sat here before and admitted my own faults. If you're thinking this sounds paranoid, consider the Queen Mother's position. Blackmail is also surprisingly common, so how do you stop it? How do you take back control? 6 wives of Henry VIII. That's what she is known for. But, according to the Bullen, Anne was just a lowly servant girl who got pregnant by Henry. And if that's true, where's the proof? Well, they say Elizabeth could impossibly be Henry's child because he wouldn't have sent her to live with her mother in relative comfort after the execution, if she was his legit daughter. Now, to that, maybe he wanted to keep up the appearance of legitimacy for as long as possible. To the people who believe Elizabeth was Henry's daughter, no amount of evidence will convince them otherwise. And the same goes for those who think she wasn't. Both sides agree on one thing, though. Elizabeth was a badass. She went on to become the Queen of England at age 25 and reigned for 44 years. She survived 2 assassination attempts, defeated the Spanish Armada, and established England as a major player in world trade. Honestly, we have no idea how she did it all without knowing who her father was. After all, he went through a lot of trouble to marry Anne, and wouldn't have gotten a divorce if it was unnecessary. The problem is we don't know exactly how much the public knew about Henry's questionable decisions. There's no record of anyone ever asking him, "Hey, just checking, but are you sure Elizabeth is yours?" Historians say Henry did send many illegitimate children to live with wet nurses and servants while their mothers stayed in the royal court. Sounds like a regular guy. But was Elizabeth really Henry VIII's daughter? You know, the one they say he had with Anne Boleyn after he chopped off her head? Oh, and don't forget to stay tuned for more historical parenting pitfalls, including more of the, why would Henry let her keep the title of princess? Well, he may have done that to keep up the ruse. In fact, the theory goes Elizabeth was so well loved by the people They probably knew she was the real princess. Well, that's the official story. But now hold on to your papers because some people are saying it wasn't Anne at all. If Elizabeth isn't Henry VIII Teed's kid, then who is? Well, the prime suspect is someone you've probably never heard of. Mary, Queen of Scots. See, Mary was the daughter of Henry's older sister, Margaret Tudor, and Mary came to live with her Aunt Catherine and Uncle Henry when she was just 2 years old. Supposedly, Henry took one look at little Mary and said, "That's my daughter." But that was only after he had a long chat with the Pope about getting an annulment from Catherine, the woman who was actually his cousin. Yeah, that was a thing back then. It was someone else entirely. Suddenly, Henry started calling Elizabeth his daughter, which is weird because he hadn't mentioned her at all before. Some people say he only did it to secure the succession. If Elizabeth wasn't his, then Mary should be next in line. But Mary was already married to the future King of France. Henry didn't want another queen consort like his sister Margaret. He wanted a strong female monarch just like him. And he thought Elizabeth was perfect for the job. Someone who may have been Elizabeth's mother. Anne was a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, the first of Henry's wives. And the theory goes, if Elizabeth was a secret love child, now if we're going to play this game, we might as well go all in. Anyway, a few years later, Mary and her mother both died. Well, others say there's a different reason Henry called Elizabeth his daughter. But maybe we shouldn't worry about the big reveal because the truth is, it doesn't matter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a sudden urge to watch The Crown. Elizabeth I of England came to power in 1558 at a time when women weren't supposed to be in charge. There were also rumors that she had a thing for men. A lot of people, including most of the Privy Council, wanted Elizabeth gone because she was Protestant in a predominantly Catholic country and unmarried, refusing to marry any of the many suitors her advisors set up for her. The theory goes that Henry VIII had a sex change operation on his daughter after she was born because he wanted an heir and because God had just made a giant cosmic oopsie-daisy by giving birth to a girl. We don't know because records were kept pretty fuzzy back then. But since she never married, it's kind of beside the point. Was she the greatest female monarch in English history? Kinda. She didn't write any laws that treated women worse than men, but she did make some questionable choices when it came to her personal relationships, like favoring one advisor over another, or choosing to ignore Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, after he was implicated in the murder of his wife. Come on, Elizabeth, you gotta pick and choose your friends better. Otherwise, next thing you know, you're executed by your own people, and there's yet another king on the throne of England. Good heavens, this is unlikely. Surgery, as we understand it, wasn't developed until hundreds of years later. And we can safely assume that Henry VIII wouldn't have entrusted his daughter's reconstructive surgery to the guy who just invented trepanation. Moreover, Elizabeth exhibited all the expected signs of puberty for a female at the appropriate times. She just didn't experience the wet dream variety of said puberty, but neither do 10% of females today. So it's not a deal-breaker, even though Parliament passed laws requiring her to wed. Intersex people are born with both male and female sexual characteristics due to variations in sex chromosomes or hormone levels. For example, people with androgen insensitivity syndrome have a genetic male karyotype, meaning they have two X chromosomes, but they're resistant to androgens, the male hormones. So they develop female secondary sex characteristics, but they still have the genes of a male. But again, Elizabeth would have had to undergo surgery to bring her body into full female form. And given that she likely experienced menopause, she probably did not have a full set of male chromosomes. Also, medical professionals have pointed out that Elizabeth's reported lack of pubic hair could have been caused by a number of things, including being overweight, having hormonal imbalances, or being an asthenic female, which is an actual medical diagnosis that means you have low body fat. Some scholars even blame Elizabeth's underwear, which may have been designed to hide the goods. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is absolutely zero evidence that Elizabeth had a penis. Sorry, internet detectives. Your queen was not a man. And she managed to stay out of the crosshairs of the Catholic assassins who wanted her dead for being a Protestant heretic. She also made enemies of the very advisors who brought her to power by ignoring them or replacing them with people who flattered her ego more. And she bested Mary, Queen of Scots, who wanted Elizabeth's throne by accusing Mary of plotting to kill her and then having Mary executed. And then Elizabeth outmaneuvered the Spanish Armada too, although that was more good fortune than good management on her part. In fact, Elizabeth was such a capable monarch that historians rank her among the greatest in England as otherwise quite bad history, which meant there was no way she could produce an heir. Parliament even offered the crown to her cousin, the aforementioned Lady Jane Grey, basically saying, "Hey, Jane, you want to be queen? Cool, come on down. Also, get ready to rule over a kingdom that doesn't really want you to." Northumberland thought he'd be clever by making Jane regent while Elizabeth took a victory lap around the countryside. But Elizabeth got wind of the plot and marched straight to London with her army, ending Jane's reign after only 9 days. Although Elizabeth did keep her advisors on their toes. They didn't really know if they could trust her or not. And we don't know if she knew that they didn't know if they could trust her or not. Specifically handsome young men who might have fathered her illegitimate son. So was she the first transgender monarch? Did she have a secret son? And what does the science say about the likelihood of a Tudor queen having a penis? Let's dig into this royal rumble in the jungle. When Elizabeth I ascended to the throne, the dastardly Duke of Northumberland tried to foist Lady Jane Grey, a 17-year-old girl, onto the throne instead. She was famous for being evasive. The rumor mill, however, churned out stories about her private life, the one claiming she was born with male genitalia. And yet some people have wondered if Elizabeth had male-to-female double-sex characteristics, aka intersex traits. Was she a man? No. Did she have a son with a man? Thanks for watching.